They were the kings and queens of the silver screen, elegant on camera, polished in interviews, and picture-perfect on every magazine cover. But when the cameras stopped rolling and the studio gates closed behind them, some of Hollywood's biggest stars transformed into something the publicity departments worked overtime to hide. We're talking about stars who didn't just attend parties, they detonated them. Stars who drank entire bars dry, started fistfights with senators, skinny-dipped in fountains at black-tie galas, and once released live animals into a crowded ballroom just to see what would happen. Stars whose behavior was so outrageous, so reckless, so gloriously unhinged that the studios had to deploy entire teams of fixers just to keep their names out of the morning papers. These weren't quiet after-hours gatherings with cocktails and conversation. These were legendary, furniture-smashing, reputation-destroying, career-threatening spectacles, thrown by and starring some of the most famous people on the planet. From Errol Flynn's infamous Mulholland Drive mansion to Tallulah Bankhead walking into a party wearing nothing but a fur coat and a dare, these are the old Hollywood stars who were notorious for their wild behavior at Hollywood parties. Errol Flynn. If Hollywood ever had an official patron saint of debauchery, it was Errol Flynn. The Tasmanian-born actor who swashbuckled his way to stardom in Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood didn't just live life on the edge, he built a mansion on it and threw a party every night. Flynn's home on Mulholland Drive became ground zero for some of the most infamous gatherings in Hollywood history. The house itself seemed designed for sin. It featured hidden rooms, two-way mirrors, and by multiple accounts, peepholes that allowed observation of guest bedrooms. Flynn was open about the fact that his home was built for entertainment of the most adult variety, and the guest lists reflected it. Studio executives, fellow actors, models, and an ever-rotating cast of young women passed through those doors with astonishing regularity. The drinking alone was the stuff of legend. Flynn could consume quantities of alcohol that would hospitalize most human beings and still be standing, charming, witty, and looking for the next adventure. His friend and drinking companion David Niven described evenings at Flynn's house that began with cocktails at sunset and didn't end until someone either passed out or fell into the pool, sometimes both simultaneously. Flynn himself kept a supply of vodka in everything from water bottles to hollowed-out pieces of furniture, ensuring he was never more than arm's reach from a drink regardless of where he was in the house. But the drinking was almost quaint compared to the rest of it. Flynn's parties were notorious for their sexual openness at a time when Hollywood publicly maintained strict moral standards. The contrast between the wholesome adventure hero on screen and the man who hosted these gatherings was staggering. He wrote about much of it himself in his autobiography, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, published in 1959, and even that, which was considered scandalous at the time, was widely understood to be a sanitized version of the truth. Flynn's party behavior wasn't confined to his own home either. He was banned from multiple Hollywood establishments for fighting, drinking to excess, and general mayhem. He and his close circle, which at various times included Niven, John Barrymore, and other notorious hellraisers, would descend on restaurants and clubs and leave wreckage in their wake. Warner Brothers employed fixers whose primary job was cleaning up after Flynn's escapades, paying off witnesses, and keeping stories out of the press. The phrase, "in like Flynn," didn't enter the American lexicon by accident. It was a direct reference to the ease with which he pursued pleasure and chaos in equal measure. Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead didn't walk into a room. She invaded it. The Alabama-born actress, known for her deep, raspy voice and her complete and utter refusal to care what anyone thought of her, was perhaps the most uninhibited personality old Hollywood ever produced. And at parties that lack of inhibition became the stuff of absolute legend. Tallulah's signature move, and she did it often enough that it qualifies as a signature, was stripping, not as performance, not as provocation, but seemingly out of pure indifference to the concept of clothing. There are countless accounts from fellow partygoers of Tallulah casually removing her dress mid-conversation, wandering through gatherings in various states of undress, or arriving at formal events wearing so little that even Hollywood's most jaded socialites did double takes. When asked about this habit, she reportedly shrugged it off with characteristic wit, treating nudity as simply a more comfortable way to enjoy an evening. Her verbal behavior was equally unrestrained. Tallulah said exactly what she thought, to exactly whomever she pleased, with absolutely no filter. She commented on people's appearances, their romantic partners, their talent or lack thereof, all in that unmistakable bourbon-soaked voice that carried across crowded rooms. She could be devastatingly funny, but she could also be devastatingly cruel, and at a party fueled by enough champagne, the line between the two disappeared entirely. Tallulah was also openly bisexual at a time when such openness was career suicide, and she treated Hollywood parties as her personal social hunting ground with a boldness that shocked even the most progressive members of the industry. She flirted outrageously with men and women alike, often in full view of spouses and partners, and seemed to derive genuine pleasure from the chaos that followed. Her drinking was prodigious, and her experimentation with substances was well documented. She once described herself as pure as the driven slush, and party hosts never quite knew which Tallulah would show up: the brilliantly entertaining raconteur or the whirlwind who would commandeer the evening and leave emotional wreckage scattered across the living room. Most of the time, they got both in the same night. John Barrymore. Before there were the Baldwin brothers or the modern acting dynasties, there were the Barrymores, and the most brilliantly self-destructive of them all was John. Known as the Great Profile for his devastatingly handsome features, John Barrymore was considered one of the finest actors of his generation, equally commanding on stage and screen. He was also, by virtually unanimous agreement, one of the most spectacular drunks Hollywood has ever seen. Barrymore didn't just drink at parties. He performed entire one-man shows of inebriation. He would arrive already several drinks deep, hold court with Shakespearean monologues delivered at full volume, insult the host, charm the host's wife, break something valuable, apologize with such eloquence that no one could stay angry, and then pass out in whatever location struck his fancy. His drinking companions included Errol Flynn and W.C. Fields, forming a kind of unholy trinity of Hollywood alcoholism that left a trail of empty bottles and scandalized hostesses across Beverly Hills. One of the most frequently told Barrymore stories, and there are dozens, involves his behavior at a formal dinner party, where, growing bored with the conversation, he reportedly urinated into a potted plant in full view of the assembled guests, then returned to his seat and continued the conversation as though nothing had happened. Whether every such story is precisely accurate is debatable, but the sheer volume of them paints an undeniable picture of a man for whom social boundaries were merely suggestions. As his alcoholism progressed through the 1930s, Barrymore's party behavior shifted from charmingly outrageous to genuinely concerning. He would become combative, confused, and sometimes unable to recognize people he had known for years. Friends described watching him deteriorate in real time at social gatherings, the wit still flickering but increasingly buried under layers of alcohol and physical decline. He died in 1942 at 60, his body ravaged by years of excess. Even his death spawned a legendary party story: the possibly apocryphal tale that Errol Flynn and friends borrowed his corpse from the funeral home and propped it in a chair to give their drinking buddy one last night out. Whether true or embellished, the fact that people believed it tells you everything about how John Barrymore was remembered. Clara Bow. Clara Bow was the original It Girl, the defining sex symbol of the 1920s, a silent film superstar whose energy, charisma, and raw magnetism made her the biggest box office draw of her era. And her parties, were as wild as her screen presence suggested. Bow's Beverly Hills home was a nonstop social hub where the guest lists mixed Hollywood royalty with athletes, musicians, and whoever else caught Clara's eye, which was a considerable number of people. She was famous for her romantic appetites, and her gatherings frequently blurred the line between party and something far more intimate. Rumors about her exploits, some confirmed, many exaggerated, a few genuinely scandalous, kept the gossip columns running at full speed throughout the late 1920s. The most infamous allegations came from her former secretary, Daisy DeVoe, who, after being fired, went public with claims about Clara's personal life that scandalized the nation. DeVoe alleged everything from gambling parties to romantic encounters with multiple partners, including, most notoriously, the entire starting lineup of the USC football team. While that particular claim has been widely disputed by historians and was likely fabricated or wildly exaggerated by a disgruntled employee, it stuck to Clara like glue and became part of her legend whether she wanted it or not. What is well documented is that Clara Bow lived fast, partied hard, and made no apologies for it. She gambled enthusiastically, drank freely, and kept hours that would have exhausted someone twice her size. She was a fixture at the most raucous Hollywood gatherings of the Roaring Twenties, and her presence guaranteed that any event would be memorable. She surrounded herself with a circle of friends who matched her energy, and together they tore through the decade with an abandon that perfectly captured the spirit of the jazz age. But the party caught up with her. The transition to sound film, combined with the scandal generated by DeVoe's revelations and Clara's own struggles with severe anxiety and what would today likely be diagnosed as mental health conditions, effectively ended her career by the early 1930s. The it girl, who had burned brighter than anyone, retreated from Hollywood entirely, spending her later years in quiet seclusion, a stark contrast to the woman who had once turned every party into front-page news. Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle. Roscoe Arbuckle was one of the biggest comedy stars of the silent era, both literally and figuratively. A physical comedian of remarkable agility despite his large frame, he was earning millions and was one of the most beloved entertainers in America. His parties were legendary in early Hollywood, lavish, alcohol-soaked affairs that attracted the biggest names in the young film industry. But one party in September 1921 destroyed everything. Arbuckle hosted a gathering at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco over Labor Day weekend. During the party, a young actress named Virginia Rappe became seriously ill and died several days later of peritonitis caused by a ruptured bladder. Another party guest, Maud Delmont, a woman with her own complicated history, accused Arbuckle of assaulting Rappe, and the resulting scandal became the biggest in Hollywood history up to that point. Arbuckle was tried 3 times for manslaughter. The first 2 trials ended in hung juries, and the third resulted in a full acquittal, with the jury taking the extraordinary step of issuing a written apology to Arbuckle, stating that there was not the slightest proof to support the charges, and that he had been the victim of a great injustice. But the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. The scandal transformed the public's perception of Hollywood parties from glamorous events into dens of vice and corruption. Arbuckle's films were banned. His career was obliterated overnight. He was blacklisted from the industry he had helped build. The man who had been one of the highest-paid entertainers in the world was reduced to directing low-budget comedies under a pseudonym just to survive. Arbuckle's story became the cautionary tale that hung over every Hollywood party for the next decade and directly led to the creation of the Hays Code Censorship Office. One wild weekend, and the accusations that followed, didn't just end Arbuckle's career, it changed the entire entertainment industry. He died in 1933 at 46, just hours after signing a new contract with Warner Brothers. That was supposed to mark his comeback. He never got the chance. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner was, by many accounts, the most beautiful woman in Hollywood. and she partied like she was trying to prove that beauty and chaos were two sides of the same coin. Raised in rural North Carolina, Ava arrived in Hollywood as a teenager and quickly discovered that she had a taste for nightlife that rivaled anyone in the business. She could drink most men under the table, stay out until dawn, and show up on set the next morning still looking like a goddess. A combination that made her both irresistible and absolutely infuriating to studio executives who lived in terror of what she might do next. Her parties and her social life were inseparable from her romantic entanglements, and those entanglements were volcanic. Her marriage to Frank Sinatra, which lasted from 1951 to 1957, produced some of the most legendary fights and reconciliations in Hollywood history. The two of them together at a party were either the most magnetic couple in the room or a five-alarm fire, sometimes both within the same hour. They threw things, screamed at each other across crowded restaurants, and reportedly caused thousands of dollars in hotel room damage during their most heated arguments. But Ava didn't need Frank to cause a scene. She was perfectly capable on her own. She was known for dancing on tables at nightclubs, swimming fully clothed, or not at all, in other people's pools, and engaging in verbal confrontations with anyone who annoyed her, regardless of their status or importance. Her time in Spain, where she lived for much of the 1950s and 1960s, became legendary. She immersed herself in the flamenco scene, befriended bullfighters, and threw parties that lasted for days, fueled by Spanish wine and her seemingly inexhaustible appetite for living at full volume. Studio publicists worked overtime to manage her image, but Ava made it nearly impossible. She simply didn't care. She once described Hollywood as a town that would have been considered rinky-dink if it wasn't for the movie business, and she treated its social conventions with matching contempt. She partied on her terms with whoever she wanted for as long as she wanted, and the consequences could sort themselves out in the morning. Lupe Velez, the Mexican Spitfire, was a force of nature who made every party she attended feel like it might end in either a celebration or an explosion. Born in San Luis Potosí, Mexico, Velez arrived in Hollywood in the late 1920s and quickly became known as much for her off-screen fireworks as her on-screen talent. Her parties were extravagant, loud, and utterly unpredictable. She served Mexican food and tequila at a time when Hollywood soirees were all champagne and canapés, and her gatherings had an energy that was completely distinct from the controlled elegance most stars aimed for. Lupe danced, sang, told bawdy jokes, and generally treated her own parties as performance opportunities, where the only rule was that there were no rules. Her tempestuous relationship with Gary Cooper produced some of Hollywood's most talked-about scenes, both romantic and combative. The two of them together at social events were a spectacle unto themselves, and their arguments, which could erupt anywhere and at any volume, became the stuff of industry gossip. After Cooper, her marriage to Johnny Weissmuller, Tarzan himself, was equally volatile, with both parties contributing to public scenes that kept the tabloids fed for years. Lupe was uninhibited in ways that went far beyond what 1930s Hollywood considered acceptable. She said whatever came to mind, in English or Spanish or a combination of both, and she didn't modulate her behavior based on who was watching. She was fearless at parties, confronting anyone she perceived as disrespectful, flirting with whomever she pleased, and generally behaving with an authenticity that was either refreshing or terrifying, depending on your perspective. Tragically, Lupe Velez died by suicide in December 1944 at the age of 36, a death that was itself surrounded by rumor and sensationalized reporting. The woman who had lived so loudly and so boldly was gone far too soon, leaving behind a legacy as one of Hollywood's most unforgettable and untamable personalities. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra didn't just attend parties, he controlled them. When Sinatra walked into a room, the atmosphere shifted, the music changed, the drinks got stronger, and everyone present understood, on some instinctual level, that the evening was now operating on Frank's terms. Sinatra's party persona was a complex cocktail of extraordinary charm and genuine menace. He could be the most magnetic, generous, entertaining host imaginable, buying rounds for entire restaurants, serenading guests with impromptu performances, making everyone in the room feel like they were part of something special. He could also, with very little provocation, turn violent. Sinatra's temper was legendary, and the list of people he punched, threatened, or physically confronted at parties and nightclubs reads like a Hollywood directory. As the leader of the Rat Pack, alongside Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop, Sinatra presided over what might be the most famous social circle in entertainment history. Their Las Vegas residencies were essentially extended parties with musical interludes, and the stories that emerged from those years are practically inexhaustible. Entire floors of the Sands Hotel were commandeered. The drinking was continuous, the gambling was reckless, and Frank was the sun around which everything orbited. But Sinatra's party behavior had a darker edge that went beyond high spirits. He had connections to organized crime figures that were well documented, and those connections sometimes surfaced at social events in ways that made other guests profoundly uncomfortable. He used his physical presence and his reputation to intimidate people, and there are numerous accounts of journalists, photographers, and even fellow celebrities being roughed up or threatened for offending Frank at social gatherings. His relationships, particularly with Ava Gardner and later Mia Farrow, added additional combustibility to any event he attended. Sinatra at a party was like a live wire, electrifying and dangerous in equal measure. People wanted to be near him because the energy was intoxicating, but they also knew that the evening could turn on a dime. That unpredictability was part of what made him Sinatra, and part of what made every party he touched unforgettable. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart cultivated an image of tough guy cool, the trench coat, the cigarette, the world-weary squint. But behind that cool exterior was a man who, especially when drinking, could be one of the most provocative and combative presences at any Hollywood gathering. Bogart was a founding member of the self-proclaimed Holmby Hills Rat Pack, the original Rat Pack, before Sinatra's crew adopted the name. This group, which included Bogart, his wife Lauren Bacall, David Niven, Judy Garland, and others, was dedicated to, as Bacall described it, drinking a lot of bourbon and staying up late. Their gatherings were boozy, intellectual, and occasionally destructive, with Bogart typically at the center, glass in hand, provoking arguments for sport. Bogart loved to argue, not politely disagree, argue with full rhetorical force and deliberate provocation. He would pick a position at a party, any position, sometimes one he didn't even believe in, and defend it with prosecutorial intensity just to see who would take the bait. He insulted people he liked, challenged people he admired, and generally treated social gatherings as arenas for verbal combat. When combined with significant quantities of scotch, these tendencies could make Bogart either the most stimulating or the most exhausting person at any event. His confrontations weren't always verbal. There are documented incidents of Bogart getting into physical altercations at restaurants and nightclubs, including a famous 1949 incident at the El Morocco nightclub in New York that involved a dispute over stuffed panda bears. Yes, actual stuffed pandas, and resulted in accusations, lawsuits, and tabloid headlines. The details of that particular evening remain disputed, but the broad strokes, Bogart, alcohol, argument, chaos, were entirely consistent with his reputation. What made Bogart's party behavior notable was the contrast with his screen persona. On film, he was controlled, laconic, the epitome of understated masculinity. At parties, especially late at night with enough bourbon in him, he was a provocateur who seemed to genuinely enjoy testing how far he could push the people around him before something broke. Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum was Hollywood's original outlaw, a man who seemed to exist entirely outside the rules that governed everyone else in the industry, and whose behavior at parties reflected a fundamental indifference to consequences that was both thrilling and alarming. Mitchum's party reputation was established early and decisively. In 1948, he was arrested for marijuana possession at a party in Laurel Canyon, a scandal that, in an era of strict moral codes, should have ended his career. Instead, Mitchum served 60 days on a prison farm, emerged, and became even more popular. The arrest didn't shame him, it enhanced his mystique. He was the guy who did what he wanted and dared Hollywood to punish him for it. At parties, Mitchum was a paradox. He could be quiet, almost brooding, sitting in a corner observing the room with heavy-lidded detachment. Then, without warning, he could become the loudest, most dominant presence in the building, telling stories in that unmistakable baritone, drinking with an endurance that stunned even hardened Hollywood drinkers, and engaging in behavior that ranged from hilariously inappropriate to genuinely reckless. He was known for his complete lack of pretension, which itself became a kind of provocation in image-obsessed Hollywood. While other stars carefully managed their public appearances at parties, Mitchum showed up looking like he'd just rolled out of bed and didn't particularly care if anyone noticed. He said what he thought, drank what he wanted, and if someone had a problem with it, that was their problem, not his. Mitchum's substance use went well beyond alcohol. He was open about marijuana use decades before it was remotely acceptable, and his experimentation with other substances was an open secret in the industry. At parties, this translated into a looseness and unpredictability that made him both a magnet and a liability. Hosts loved having him because he was genuinely fascinating company. They feared having him because there was simply no telling where the evening would end. He once described Hollywood as a place where they'll pay you $50,000 for a kiss and 50 cents for your soul. And his behavior at industry gatherings suggested a man who had internalized that observation and decided to enjoy the kiss while keeping a firm grip on whatever was left of his soul. They drank too much, fought too often, loved too recklessly, and burned through the night like it would never end. They were reckless and brilliant, destructive and magnetic, larger than life in ways that made ordinary behavior feel like a waste of time. These weren't just party stories. They were reflections of an era when Hollywood operated without safety nets, without social media, and without the constant surveillance that governs celebrity life today. The studios could cover up almost anything, and that freedom, or that lack of accountability, produced behavior that was by turns hilarious, shocking, tragic, and unforgettable. Some of these stars paid dearly for their excesses. Others walked away with nothing more than a hangover and a great story, but all of them left behind legends that outlasted their films, their scandals, and in some cases, their lives. Because in old Hollywood, the real show was never on the screen. It was at the party afterward. If you made it this far, you already know these stories deserve to be shared. Hit subscribe, drop a comment, and tell us, which Hollywood wildcard would you have wanted at your party? And which one would you have locked the door against? Until next time.